Matthew chapter 18, verses 7 through 11. Leading up to this point, Jesus taught Peter that sons are exempt from the civil and ceremonial laws. When asking, who the greatest in the kingdom of heaven is, Jesus answered his disciples by saying, it's those who humble themselves like children, like adopted children of God. They are the greatest, not those who try to work for their righteousness. In fact, to even enter the kingdom of heaven, we must be converted and become like children rather than strangers. And then in the last part of the passage last week, Jesus warned his disciples, whoever causes one of these little ones, those adopted by the Father as Christians, who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for him to have a heavy millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea. And in today's passage, Jesus continues teaching his disciples about stumbling blocks. So this must be important because Jesus is spending quite a bit of time here on stumbling blocks, what it means to be a stumbling block and the dangers of being a stumbling block. So we're going to get at that tonight. We're going to see this passage, Matthew chapter 18, verses 7 through 11 in three parts. Stumbling blocks are necessary. Jesus teaches that. Verses 8 and 9, avoiding stumbling blocks, or this is actually the popular teaching of the day. And then verses 10 and 11, a warning for the disciples, Jesus' view in contrast to the popular teaching of the day, verses 8 and 9. So if someone would please read verses 7 through 11 here. Well, let's start walking through this. We'll start with verse 7. Jesus teaches that stumbling blocks are necessary. Jesus says, and this is to his disciples, remember in chapter 18, verse 1, we learned Jesus is talking to his disciples. He's responding to their question, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And this is still part of that response. Woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks, for it is inevitable that stumbling blocks come. But woe to that man through whom the stumbling block comes. Now, some of you have stuff about temptation and sin in there. What would be the difference between saying woe to the world because of temptation to sin, or woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks? Is there any difference there? And why would that be a difference? Why does this matter? The word for stumble is scandalizo. This sounds like an English word we have, scandal, right? Scandalizo, stumble. The word for sin is hamartia, or hamatano in this case. And the word for temptation is perasmos. Now, the word for sin and the word for temptation aren't in the Greek at all. So I wonder why some translations use those words. I mean, is it the same thing as sin and temptation, or are stumbling blocks something different? And we just remember the context leading up to this point. I remember Jesus, he taught Peter about his exemption from the law, right? The civil and ceremonial law, not moral law, but civil and ceremonial laws, as a son of God. And then Jesus teaches, you must be converted and become like children, or you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. You must be adopted children rather than strangers, which means exempt from the civil and ceremonial laws. That's what it means to be like children, to live by faith rather than by works. And then he starts talking here about stumbling blocks. And he got to stumbling blocks in the previous passage in verse 6. After talking about whoever receives one such child, talking about those adopted by God, right, as adopted children, and my name receives me, but whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, which means the stumbling block, the person causing one of God's children to stumble, is causing them to, instead of live like adopted children by faith, instead to revert back to legalism under the law. So the whole stumbling block thing, what it means for someone or something to be a stumbling block, for there to be stumbling blocks in the world, means this is something that is seeking to draw children of God, who are children of God by grace and through faith, seeking to draw them back into the legalism of the world. And this makes sense in Matthew's gospel. Every turn of the page in Matthew's gospel, Matthew is attacking the legalism of the Pharisees. And every turn of the page. Matthew, he's writing to a Jewish audience. His gospel is a very Jewish gospel. He's having to address the Jewish religion, in light of Christ's incarnation, his crucifixion, resurrection, in light of salvation by grace through faith. And so as he's proving Jesus as the Messiah, he's also addressing what that means for legalistic religion. And he's really getting at that right here. I'm talking about stumbling blocks, and a stumbling block is something that causes the children of God, who are children by grace through faith, to revert to some sort of worldly, or in this, Jewish legalism, works-based righteousness, trying to, again, subject them under the law that they've been freed from. And Jesus says, woe to the world because of stumbling blocks. Why woe to the world? In the world, there are stumbling blocks everywhere that cause all sorts of people to live according to some works-based sort of righteousness. The whole world is this way. The whole world is works-based righteousness, except for Christians who have been converted to be like children. Now, if we start looking at this passage and start seeing it in that temptation and sin and those terms, and we can't get away from reading this verse like that, it is really, really going to mess with our interpretation of Matthew's gospel here. And it's going to mess with our interpretation in a really negative way. Matthew will talk about sin, but this isn't where he talks about sin, right? And the word he used here, Matthew is intentional about this. He uses the word for stumbling blocks, scandalizo. Later in chapter 18, when we get to, discipline, church discipline, or going to a brother who sins against you, there for sin, he uses the word hamartia. So Matthew distinguishes between the two. When we're reading Matthew's gospel, we need to distinguish between the two as well. We need to know how Matthew's differentiating between stumble and sin, because Matthew uses two different terms on purpose. Right? Inevitable. Matthew doesn't tell us why it's inevitable. I ask why because, I don't know, I just want us to think about it. Matthew doesn't tell us why it's inevitable. This text doesn't tell us why it's inevitable. I know previously in Matthew's gospel we talked about why it was necessary that there was false teaching in the world. Now the stumbling blocks here, false teaching falls into this sort of category if you're teaching legalism, right? Causing people to stumble based on teaching a false gospel, a prosperity gospel, or a legalistic gospel. And we asked why does God allow there to be such false teaching if he feels so strongly against it? This has been a while, so I don't expect anybody to remember that conversation. But basically the consensus we came to was because if there's false teaching out there, it forces Christians to wrestle with some stuff, and to wrestle with doctrine, and to wrestle with who God really is and how God presents himself, and to wrestle with what the Bible really says. There are some things we wouldn't care to know if somebody wasn't teaching something different, right? So I think stumbling blocks are in the world, one, for the sanctification of believers, two, to sift wheat from weeds, in a sense. Because you have people of the world, worldly people aren't going to be able to stand a church that glorifies God and exalts Jesus Christ. And Christians, people who really are trying to follow Christ and want to know Christ, they're not going to be able to stand a church where they're preaching something that's not the biblical gospel. So I think it's one way God probably sifts the wheat from the weeds. I think God's at work doing that. So it is inevitable that stumbling blocks must come. And then Jesus issues this warning, but woe to that man through whom the stumbling block comes.
Yes.
So this is where I have heard many preachers and teachers and seen it in commentaries start getting off track just because they haven't taken the time to parse out, okay, what is a stumbling block? And immediately they start going to, oh, well, don't you dare cause your brother to fall into sin, right? And that sort of interpretation. And that's not what Matthew is getting at here in this text, right? And I'm clarifying here in this text. Because it is really bad for us to cause brothers and sisters to fall into sin if we do that, right? That is bad, but that's not what this particular verse is getting at, this particular text. He says, woe to the man through whom that stumbling block comes. The stumbling block is the things, are the things that cause children who have been adopted by God, by grace through faith, to revert back to some sort of legalistic living or thinking. To experience some sort of falling from the doctrines of grace. That would be the stumbling block. So Matthew is saying here that this is a shot at the popular religion of the day. This is a shot at Second Temple Judaism and the way that it works. The reason people think that they're great in the kingdom of heaven, their works. Matthew is really putting that whole system to rest in a grave. And here he's saying, woe to the man through whom the stumbling block comes. Woe to the one who teaches that kind of religion. Woe to the one who presents that kind of religion, that legalism, that ritualistic sort of system that people must do, work, or abstain from certain things in order to somehow win God's favor and become the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Woe to that person. And that's Jesus' whole instruction here. Like, that's the crux of what's going on here in chapter 18 so far. Converted. You must be converted. Become like children. Humble yourselves. And that's like the call out to disciples of Jesus Christ. It's pride that leads to the other way of doing things. Verses 8 and 9.
Yes.
Now this is where the verse gets really confusing. Remember the literary context leading up to this point. Matthew, he's taking shots at legalism. And now he's quoting some teaching coming from Jesus that sure does sound like legalism. So verses 8 and 9 is probably most difficult to discern what Matthew is up to in verses 8 and 9. If your hand or foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. It is better for you to enter life crippled or lame than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and be cast into the eternal fire. If your eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out and throw it from you. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be cast into the fiery hell. Okay. This is where we have our interpretation exercise, our hermeneutics exercise, and hopefully we'll all be sharpened as a result of this exercise. There are 3 ways these 2 verses can be interpreted. Most people go with this first way, and we talked about the sin already. If your hand/eye cause you to sin, cut it off, gouge it out, get rid of it. Right? That's the most popular rendering of this, even though Matthew doesn't use the word sin at all. And back in chapter 5, verse 30, he didn't use sin there either. That's stumbling too. And in Mark's gospel, the word there is stumble and not sin. So it's not like you can import the word sin from anywhere else. Yet this is the most popular interpretation of these verses. Another interpretation, which is just considering the context of stumbling block, what it means to be a stumbling block, and importing what it means for someone to stumble into these 2 verses and reading it that way. You have, if your hand or eye, cause you to sin, these are instruments of the work that you do, or instruments of abstinence. If they cause you to think that you are righteous or great because of your works or abstinence, and then it would be like, metaphorically, cut those off, right? As in, humble yourself. And so that interpretation could make sense. Jesus could also be critically referencing or alluding to a Talmudic oral tradition, which in chapter 5, verses 29 and 30, when we were there, we talked about this Talmudic tradition. And it's found in the Talmud Nida 13b, and I have no idea if I pronounced that correctly. So the oral tradition is what the rabbis were teaching. So earlier on, when Jesus was talking about you break the law in order to keep the tradition of your elders.
Mm-hmm.
That's the oral tradition that would later be written down in what we now call the Talmud, right? So it was written, everything was written down. It was all oral tradition, but it was all written down before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and after that too, but most of it before the destruction of the temple, because Rome was coming in and they were sacking Jerusalem, and the Jews were afraid that their oral tradition was going to be lost, so they wrote it down before the destruction of the temple. Which interpretation here makes sense? How do we even discern which interpretive line to take, or which interpretive stance to take? This is the trouble I go through on a weekly basis, by the way. See the text and I see the different interpretations, and the hard work is discerning which one of those is the correct interpretation of the text. Let me work through some of the interpretive challenges a little bit. So with the first interpretation, if your hand or eye causes you to sin, of course the first challenge is that the word sin is not in here. So that would be the first challenge, right? For me, that's enough to make me throw out number one. But if that's not enough, that would work against the entire movement of Matthew's gospel, especially here in chapter 17 and 18, where Jesus has explicitly taught children are exempt from the civil and ceremonial laws, where Matthew is addressing this idea that anyone can be great because of his or her works, where Matthew's quoted Jesus here in verse 7, the first verse. It's inevitable that stumbling blocks come, this reversion to some sort of legalism. Woe to the man through whose stumbling blocks come. And then people read verses 8 and 9 and teach it as that form of legalism, like cut off your hand if it causes you to sin. Like if we use the first interpretation here, we basically become that stumbling block Jesus was talking about in verse 7. So we end up contradicting our own teaching, and Jesus' teaching, which is not cool, right? The other difficulty we have with the first interpretation here is when we get to verses 10 and 11, Jesus is back to, do not despise one of these little ones, those adopted by the Father, the children of God. For I say to you that their angels they continually see the face of my Father who is in heaven. And so even that, like, don't despise anyone. Like, if we're talking about, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off, and we're thinking about people like that, then that's going to cause us to despise others. So it just doesn't work with this passage of Scripture to interpret it in this way. It doesn't work with the movement of Matthew's entire gospel. It doesn't fit with the message of the New Testament. You even get to, like, Colossians chapter 2, and the Apostle Paul, he knows Jesus' teachings intimately, and he's teaching them in his epistles, and he says stuff like, why do you have those rules that you have? Do not touch and do not taste, like that. Don't you know that those rules aren't actually profitable for curbing self-indulgence? So that sort of rendering or that interpretation of verses 8 and 9, it doesn't fit with Matthew's gospel, and it doesn't fit with the New Testament as a whole. In fact, if we start teaching 8 and 9 like that, like number 1 up here, if your hand or eye causes you to sin, cut it off or gouge it out, then we end up, just contradicting the whole message of the Bible, which is not a place we really want to be. At least I don't think we want to be there. What about the second possible interpretation here? So I don't think we want to go with the first one. It presents way too many problems to be confident in that rendering, that interpretation of the text. What about the second one here? If your hand or eye, which are instruments of work or abstinence, the things you do religion with, right? If they cause you to think you are righteous or great, which, that makes sense in context, because of your works or abstinence, then humble yourself would be how that works out. It'd be metaphorical, it'd be then humble yourself like children. What do you think about the second interpretation here? Does that work? Are there any problems with that? Is it a good interpretation? Oh, yeah, one of the other problems with like the first interpretation is if Jesus is like teaching that it's better to enter life without your limbs or without your eyes. What is he having a kingdom full of maimed people? Is Jesus not? Has he not promised to complete us and perfect us? Is he not sanctifying us? Is he not building his church? And instead, he's He's cutting off all of his people's limbs because they can't stop
But
sinning.
I know.
So that's another problem with number one. And so in number two, yeah, it's this, what I'm setting aside is then my pride, the tool. That's right. What I'm setting aside is that. And so then I'm following Jesus, and that is being conformed more to the likeness of Jesus Christ. That is the process of sanctification. That is me becoming more complete, perfected, conformed to the image of Christ. Score for the second interpretation here, because it makes sense in light of God's work of redemption and sanctification. If I am doing some really good works, I'm using my hands to do those works.
That's true.
Right?
Yeah.
And then I boast about those and teach that that's how people become great in the kingdom of heaven. That's a stumbling block. Here is the greatest difficulty with accepting the second possible interpretation here. In fact, it's pretty much the only real difficulty I found, is that in order to get at the second possible interpretation here, you have to recognize that Jesus is doing something different in verses 8 and 9 that he is in verses 7, 10, and 11.
Yes.
And there are no pointers here to say that Jesus is doing something different. So when Jesus tells a parable, if this becomes illustrative, right? If Jesus is getting at the second interpretation here, like these are instruments of your religion, and therefore set aside your pride, then 8 and 9 become an illustration, much like a parable. And before Jesus started his parables, what does he say? Something like, the kingdom of heaven is like, and there's a clear indicator there that Jesus is moving into an illustration. Matthew's pretty consistent about that, and we don't have any pointing here to show us that, hey, Jesus is about to give an illustration rather than literally tell you to cut off your hand or something like that. So that's just the biggest difficulty here, and the thing that makes me hesitant about interpretation number 2. Now, I really like interpretation number 2.
Well, it's practical.
Yeah, I really like it, but I don't know if I'm willing to go there because we just don't have those pointers in the text to say it's okay to go there, you know. And that's one of the difficulties, too, in interpretation. Practicing good hermeneutic is, man, I can come up with an interpretation I really like, but then discerning whether or not the text goes there is a whole different story. That right there brings us to the third interpretation. Again, there are no pointings. That would be a difficulty for the third interpretation as well. There are no pointings indicating that Jesus is now critically referring to the Talmudic oral tradition. But Jesus has done this before in Matthew's gospel. That's why it's important for us to look at the whole gospel, to read it in order to consider everything all at once with each passage. Bring Matthew, the whole gospel of Matthew, to bear down on each passage in Matthew, and then the whole Bible to bear down on each passage that we were in. It's this important. That's how we teach expositorily. Because of chapter 5, verses 29 and 30, we can discern that Jesus is doing this again. He's doing it again. This is the second time. And in chapter 5, we discovered that it's almost definite that Jesus was referring to the Talmudic tradition. There he was referring to bad teaching of the Pharisees, right? He did that in the Sermon on the Mount with several teachings. And now he's quoting this again. Now he's quoting it at fuller length. And this isn't an exact quote. It's an allusion, but this is probably the way it was presented most often because it's concise and easy to understand. So Jesus, he says, like, woe to that man through whom the stumbling block comes. And then he alludes for a second time to this part of the Talmud, the oral tradition, the religious teaching of the day. Like, and here's that stumbling block, and those who teach this are the stumbling blocks. That seems to be what Jesus is doing here. And to notice that there are far less difficulties in the previous 2 possible interpretations. Because you can say, yeah, since Jesus did this previously in the gospel, it's not a stretch to say that he's doing it again. Verses 10 and 11. I think we can do this.
I don't know.
See that you do not despise one of these little ones. Of course, these little ones there, in the context of Matthew's gospel, the literary context here, is referring to children adopted by the Father. This is referring to all Christians, and Jesus has referred to his disciples as little children before in his gospel a couple of times now. See to it that you do not despise one of these little ones. For I say to you that their angels in heaven continually see the face of my Father who is in heaven. What do you think about that? Of course, Jesus gets right back to grace again here, right? Like, okay, no, that Talmudic, that oral tradition, bad. That's legalism. This is the way it needs to be. Don't despise one of these little ones. Any child of God, don't despise any of them. What do you think, though, about this part about angels in heaven continually see the face of my Father who is in heaven? What do you think about that? Is that a little weird to anybody? When Matthew describes these angels, quotes Jesus about these angels, the angels, they are their angels. This is possessive, right? Their angels are in heaven continually seeing the face of my Father, like they're in heaven continually seeing the face of the Father. And Jesus is saying that we don't despise any Christian, any saint adopted by the Father, because this is why we don't despise one of God's children, because their angels continually see the face of my Father. What's the connection there? Why is that the reason we don't despise other Christians, brothers and sisters in the faith? He doesn't give us any details really about the angels. If we don't want to take what little is given, and it's very vague in Matthew's gospel. We don't want to take that and extrapolate it into some doctrine, because we'll probably be wrong if we do that, you know. When we looked at Hebrews chapter 1, there the preacher who's preaching the sermon to the Hebrews, he's describing how Jesus is greater than the angels. He's higher than the angels, holier than the angels. He's prophet, priest, and king. Jesus is the one who has the high office. There's no reason to worship angels. God didn't say anything about the angels that he did about Christ. And then he basically gives us the position of the angels. Didn't you know the angels are here as ministering spirits to serve those who are elect, who will receive salvation? The angels, if we are to understand the place of the angels, we understand that the angels, and it's so we think having guardian angels is cool, right? But then we read like Hebrews chapter 1, and we get more information about angels. They're not just guardian angels. The angels exist to serve God and His saints. That's why angels, right? They are ministering spirits to serve those who will receive salvation. That's just cool to think about. Yeah. I find that very comforting. When Jesus, after the temptation, he was exhausted and the angels came to minister to him. Right. How do we know the angels don't come to minister to us in our time of need too? Something important to know here. Do not despise any of God's adopted children. I call this the sin sandwich. Mm-hmm. It's either the sin sandwich or since sin is hamartia in Greek, the hamartia hoagie, or the wait. Or
can you get that Schlatskys?
Wait, or the discipline Dagwood. If you know what a Dagwood is. Yes. All right. So that's
a push and a cord.
Now this is a little smaller than a Dagwood, but whatever. So I drew a sandwich up here. In today's passage, Jesus is getting at don't despise anyone. This passage is not sin. This is do not despise any of God's adopted children, right? Don't be a stumbling block.
Okay.
And then when we get to verses 15 through 20, Matthew is going to talk about sin. He's going to talk about, well, if your brother sins, this is how you approach them and what you do. And then after that, always forgive unconditionally in verses 21 through 35. I want us to know this because in chapter 18, this is the passage we think, church discipline. It's time to address sin. And we go right to verses 15 through 20. But that is sandwiched in between two passages that are about not despising any of God's adopted children and then always forgiving unconditionally, 70 times 7, forgive your brother this many times. And so the idea of church discipline and the idea of addressing one another's sin, that doesn't happen without unconditional forgiveness, and it doesn't happen without this instruction we have not to despise any of God's adopted children. It doesn't happen outside of that context. So I just wanted to point that out for us because it's important to know. We always jump to Matthew chapter 18 to look at church discipline in isolation. And that's not healthy. And then verse 11, it's not in the earliest and best manuscripts, probably not original to Matthew's gospel, probably not included in the autograph. It doesn't change the meaning of the text at all. Just know that Matthew is writing to Jews, so to say, for the Son of Man to come and save that which was lost. For Jews, it's like, well, we weren't lost. We've always been the people of God. So I'm not sure it would have really appealed to Jews in Matthew's manuscript, but it doesn't change the meaning of the text at all. Now, when Luke wrote it, Jesus really did say this. It's in Luke's gospel, and it's really in Luke's gospel, right, in the original. Luke is writing to a bunch of Gentile people, one Gentile in particular, Theophilus, who was probably like a Roman official. So it makes sense in the context of Luke's gospel, makes a lot more sense, has a deeper meaning for Luke to write, the Son of Man came to seek and to save that which was lost, because he's writing to a Gentile. So just interesting there, doesn't change the meaning of the text at all. Let's pray.